It began with ambition, the kind that glowed like fire in the eyes of those who wanted more than success, more than recognition. They wanted dominance. A corporation that started in a modest office with a handful of determined individuals quickly grew into a towering empire, its logo plastered across cities, its influence bleeding into the daily lives of millions. In its early days, there had been a promise: innovation, progress, and prosperity for employees and investors alike. But as money poured in and power became addictive, the ideals that once shaped the company were quietly buried beneath the weight of greed. The boardroom was where the true battles were fought. Men and women in sharp suits smiled across polished tables, their voices dripping with charm and assurance as they presented numbers that glittered with promise. Beneath those figures, however, lay carefully constructed lies. Revenue was exaggerated, debts were hidden, risks were concealed under creative accounting that made even seasoned auditors nod in approval. Each quarter, the illusion grew stronger. Stock prices soared, investors celebrated, and the world looked upon the company as an untouchable giant. The executives congratulated themselves on their brilliance, never admitting that their empire stood not on innovation but on deception. Inside the cubicles, whispers spread. Junior accountants noticed irregularities, figures that didn't align, expenses that vanished without explanation. Analysts questioned projections that seemed too perfect to be real. But every time someone raised a concern, they were silenced through subtle intimidation, demotions, or promises of promotions if they learned to keep their mouths shut. Loyalty, the company said, was rewarded. Dissent, however, was punished. People learned quickly that survival meant compliance, and compliance meant turning a blind eye. The bubble grew until it could no longer contain the lies. A deal that was meant to catapult the company into a new era of dominance began to unravel under scrutiny. Regulators who had been content to look the other way suddenly found themselves forced to ask questions. Journalists who had been ignored began piecing together fragments of the story, tracing money trails that led to nowhere. Investors who once cheered at the company's quarterly results now demanded to see proof behind the numbers. The once untouchable executives could feel the walls closing in, though they still clung to their arrogance, assuring the world, and perhaps themselves, that everything was fine. Then came the collapse. Like dominoes falling, one revelation led to another, and the carefully woven fabric of deception tore apart. Billions in false assets were revealed. Entire divisions were exposed as shells designed only to inflate earnings. The stock that once symbolized prestige plummeted to worthlessness, dragging with it retirement savings, pensions, and the dreams of ordinary people who had believed in the illusion. Employees who had dedicated decades of their lives to the company were left jobless overnight, while executives retreated behind closed doors, scrambling for escape routes. The public's outrage was volcanic. Families who had invested their life savings demanded answers. Governments that had celebrated the corporation as a symbol of economic strength now condemned it as a parasite. Lawsuits piled up, investigations launched, and the once proud headquarters became a monument to betrayal. Yet even in the face of ruin, some of the executives managed to walk away with millions, shielded by golden parachutes written into their contracts. The ones who had orchestrated the deceit stood in front of cameras, their apologies polished but hollow, their expressions crafted to show regret while their eyes betrayed calculation. The fallout was more than financial. Trust in institutions crumbled. Regulators were accused of complicity, politicians of turning a blind eye in exchange for donations and favors. Other corporations, even those untainted by scandal, were suddenly viewed with suspicion. The very foundation of the market shook, and ordinary people paid the price. Retirement funds evaporated, small businesses collapsed after losing contracts, and workers struggled to rebuild their lives while the wealthy architects of the disaster hid behind legal teams and offshore accounts. In the years that followed, the story became a cautionary tale, studied in business schools and debated in courtrooms. The corporation that once symbolized success became synonymous with greed. Yet, beneath the layers of analysis and blame, the truth was painfully simple. It was never about innovation, progress, or prosperity. It was about greed, unrelenting and insatiable, a hunger that devoured billions and left behind ashes. And somewhere in the silence of the abandoned offices, in the echo of hallways that once buzzed with ambition, lingered the memory of what could have been, a company that might have built a legacy of greatness, but instead chose the path of deception, proving that greed, when left unchecked, can cost more than money. It can cost trust, livelihoods, and the very fabric of society itself. The unraveling did not end with financial collapse. The destruction seeped into human lives like poison in water, invisible at first, but devastating once felt. Families who had staked everything on the company's stock saw their savings vanish overnight. Retirees who had trusted in pensions and benefits were suddenly forced to return to work, their golden years stolen by a corporation's lies. Some could not bear the weight of loss. Newspaper columns soon carried stories of ruined men and women who ended their lives in despair, unable to reconcile decades of effort with the sudden void of nothingness. The communities built around the corporation began to crumble. In towns where the company had been the largest employer, empty buildings stood like tombstones, windows dark, machinery silent. Restaurants, shops, and schools that depended on the prosperity of workers found themselves starved of customers and funding. Entire neighborhoods slipped into decay as homes were foreclosed, families uprooted, and dreams dismantled brick by brick. The corporation had been more than just a business. It had been the heart of entire communities. When it fell, it took those communities with it. Inside the company, the betrayal cut deepest. Loyal employees who had believed in the mission, who had sacrificed nights and weekends, discovered they were nothing more than expendable pawns. Middle managers who had once repeated the slogans of integrity and excellence were left to shoulder blame for decisions made in boardrooms they were never allowed to enter. Some tried to blow the whistle, but their voices were drowned in the roar of legal threats, smear campaigns, and the crushing machinery of corporate power. The executives, meanwhile, played the role of victims, claiming ignorance, shifting responsibility, and disappearing behind gated estates while ordinary workers were left to pick up shattered lives. The courts became theaters of spectacle. One by one, the executives appeared, their suits immaculate, their testimonies rehearsed. They spoke of unfortunate circumstances, of misjudgments, of market conditions that had spiraled out of control. Yet leaked emails and internal memos painted a darker truth, a culture that celebrated deception, that rewarded those who could manipulate numbers rather than create value, that turned a blind eye to morality so long as profits grew. The public demanded justice, but justice was slow and diluted. A few symbolic sentences were handed down, but many of the guilty escaped with fortunes intact, shielded by the very laws they had influenced and bent in their favor. For the investors, the fallout stretched across generations. Parents who had lost savings could no longer afford to send children to college. Young couples faced broken futures as mortgages collapsed under them. Small businesses that had supplied the corporation filed for bankruptcy, their owners drowning in debt. The losses were not measured only in billions but in broken families, in children who grew up watching the cost of greed tear through their lives. And still, in the years that followed, the lessons seemed fragile. Other corporations watched, some vowing to avoid the same path, others quietly studying how close they could come to the same edge without falling. Politicians passed new regulations with solemn speeches, but lobbyists worked behind the scenes to weaken those same rules, ensuring that history might one day repeat itself. The cycle of greed, it seemed, was eternal, each scandal fading until the next one emerged, larger and louder, built on the same foundation of deception and unchecked ambition. The name of the fallen corporation became a curse, spoken with bitterness and anger, its logo scrubbed from buildings, its legacy remembered not for innovation but for destruction. Yet perhaps the most haunting truth was not in its fall but in its rise, that a lie, carefully nurtured and beautifully packaged, could grow so vast, consume so much, and destroy so many before the world dared to see it for what it was. The story lived on not just in courtrooms and boardrooms, but in the quiet suffering of those who lost everything, in the hollow eyes of men and women who had believed in a dream that was never real. In the end, The corporate greed that cost billions was not just a headline. It was a tragedy written in numbers and signed in human pain, proof that when greed reigns unchecked, the cost is always paid by those least able to bear it.